Good afternoon. I want to begin today's event by thanking the team in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and the Hood Design Studio for handling the logistics and publicity to make today's event possible. I'm Barbara Krauthammer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and Professor of History at UMass Amherst, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural College of Humanities and Fine Arts Dean's Distinguished Lecture. This series is intended to provide a forum for interdisciplinary exchange in the humanities and the arts. Each year, the college will invite a leading scholar, practitioner, or artist to deliver the Dean's Distinguished Lecture. My goal in creating this series is to give our students, staff, and faculty the opportunity to learn from nationally and internationally acclaimed scholars and artists, to enhance the already vibrant intellectual and creative life of our culture, our college, and our university. And I hope to spark new conversations, new ideas, and inquiry in our classrooms, our studios, our labs, and performance spaces. The theme for this inaugural year is race and the American landscape, a topic that emerged from my conversations throughout the year with undergraduate and graduate students, as well as with our faculty colleagues and friends across campus. How has the history in America of racism shaped the American landscape? From our built environment and landscape architecture to ideas and laws about how we define so-called public space, how people's movement through public space is controlled and policed, to how histories and memories are embedded in the American landscape, sometimes in the physical terrain. Here we might think of the history of slavery and the construction of canals, irrigation canals on South Carolina's rice plantations, to the memorials that we build and the memorials that we take down. My hope is that by turning our attention to these questions about race and the American landscape, we can better understand the spaces in which we live, in which we move and think and teach and create. And we can also understand our individual and collective capacity to create meaning and create meaningful spaces. So today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our inaugural Dean's Distinguished Lecturer, Professor Walter Hood. Professor Hood is the creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio,
Good afternoon. I think we had some technical difficulties with the Dean, but I am Walter Hood, and thank you, Dean, for that introduction. I'm glad you didn't list all of those things anyway, because people can look to my bio on my website. But it's a pleasure to be here today. And it's also a pleasure to be the inaugural lecturer. The first is always kind of exciting, and setting the tone and trend. Been asked today to talk about our book that just came out, Black Landscapes Matter. And the question that many have asked, like, do they matter? And I would say yes. And I'm going to start out by just affirming that basic idea. But what I'd like to talk about is our work at Hood Design Studio and some of my research work that's really taken about 20 years to develop. And I want to start out with a very simple timeline. And I know everyone's familiar with the 1619 project, But last semester, my students, we were working on a post-colonial landscape, and we were having conversations about invention and when did certain things manifest in this country and as it related to race, and particularly African-American race. And so we did this simple timeline that looked at some of the great inventions in our profession, landscape architecture and urbanism, and to parallel that with what's happening culturally and socially in this country. And two sort of terms I like to posit very early is this idea of a double semiotic and a double consciousness. And J.T. Mitchell talks about seeing race through landscape. He also talks about this double semiotic, right? That it's almost like chewing gum and walking, right? As societies, that on one hand, we have slavery, and on the other hand, we have the manifestation of a country and the invention of cities, the inventions of towns, the inventions of communities, the inventions of parks. And this is all happening while certain groups of the country are isolated, are excluded from various places, are even partitioned off. And then I would say probably most familiar to us is this duplication, right? Plessy and Ferguson in the 20th century, where we actually made one landscape for some people, and then we actually produced a separate, supposed to be equal, but it was never equal, but a separate for others. And this has been our preoccupation, I think, in this country. So how do we get out of this? How do we move forward? And we've been struggling with this, as academics and professionals, because in our history, race has always been present. If you look at old Sanborn maps, old cartography, here you actually see a Negro school, right? And so race has always been there. It's just, why didn't we see it? Maybe it wasn't as important at different times, or maybe the people making the maps, it wasn't that important. But as we went through the 20th century, through the separate but equal, the semiotics of the landscape was very clear. People knew where to be based on the signs and symbols of the day. And when those symbols came down, they were still shared through culture and social, and even built into the bricks of our architecture. There was an article, I think a month ago, that went around the country looking for these old Jim Crow palimpsests. And sure enough, like in Seattle, the colored door is still there on a theater. So these reminders are still there for us to sort of see. And in the social cultural, this is from Asheboro, North Carolina, there used to be a time when there was a thing called Black Saturday. Right? This was a time when all whites left the city, and it was a time that Blacks could actually come in and be in the city. And so imagine how this might shape, right, your worldview if you were the ones partitioned or excluded. How do you navigate these kinds of terrains when those symbols disappear and you know that they're still there? I grew up in North Carolina, and in the 1970s, you could still see symbols like this. And they have a lasting impression on you. And I can remember walking down some of the roads in Fayetteville with my cousins who lived in Lillington. And when they would see a car, and it would be at night, we would have to jump into a ditch and hide, because they knew what the dangers might be within that landscape through that identity. And then through our popular culture, we have a way of creating these ostensible paths, these new paths, and we kind of accept them, right? If you think about it, that Black people used to have a book to navigate the semiotical landscape, right? And this then gets popularized in a way that begins to get romanticized. And the end of this was not pretty. It was never romantic. And that leads us to the Black semiotic that we've created then for these landscapes. We know when we're in a Black neighborhood. How is that possible, right? All of these elements are still there. The liquor stores, the check cashing places, right? The non-investment. And we begin to sort of become almost anesthetized, right, to these experiences. And this book came out of me sort of feeling that pressure when Mike Brown was murdered. And I was listening to the description of how he was murdered. He was leaving a liquor store, right? He was walking down the middle of the street. So it was the same story over and over and over again. But We never planned these environments. These environments were planned for us. This is the Rosa Parks neighborhood in Detroit, where Blacks were actually moved from Black Bottom because the freeway came through, right? And in Black Bottom, now we have a beautiful Mies van der Rohe landscape, but Blacks were moved to this neighborhood, high density, and then patrolled. And then we wonder why we have times of rebellion, right? When you put people in spaces, you ghettoize them, and then you create this trauma, there's always a combustion, right? And we saw that in this last year. And it's becoming part of our nomenclature now, the George Floyd moment. But that moment where you just can't take anymore. And then we have the development of a semiotic that people could not deal with. Writing Black Lives Matter on a street, right? This infuriated many people. But I'd like to argue that we spent a whole century dealing with the other semiotic that was acceptable, white only. But all of a sudden now when we have these new ways of thinking about space, they're contested. But this duality is America. And how do we deal with that duality? And that's been pretty much the basis for a lot of our work. But I'd like to start the lecture with a small quote by Toni Morrison, one of my heroes, heroine. And she said, "There's no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presence of, to recollect the absence of slaves. There is no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall, park or skyscraper lobby. There is no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston, Savannah, New York, Providence, or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist, this is why she had to write the book, right? And so she created a nonprofit and they've placed benches throughout the US. And they're ordinary benches. But the power of that ordinary element through the quote gives its power, but it also shows you that duality. And this is at Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. And you have to really look for this bench because most of the pedagogical displays there are for the Civil War. But very early in my career, this is Macon, Georgia, I think 1999, 2000, when we first started to deal with this idea of race. And I had spent a year abroad in Rome, and I had gone on many archaeological digs. And I started getting very interested in this notion of palimpsest, how to actually create spaces that began to create these double semiotics, these things that clash. And in this project, there was a Daughter of the Confederacy obelisk located right across from the courthouse, and it was surrounded by hedges. And we removed the hedges and built a fountain and created an axis, and then cast concrete cotton bales, which were stored here by slaves, and created this sort of dialogue. That was 20 years ago. Today, this monument is being contested to be brought down. So you can kind of see how, again, beginning to get people to see things. It might take us a while, but sometimes by just showing these things off, we can create change. Another project at about the same time as Lafayette Square in Oakland, California, we reshaped a classical colonial square to allow older Black men to use a space which was contested. We gave them electricity and we built a bathroom. This was a major thing to reinforce that we wanted this group to still be there, but also we wanted to tell the story that this park had always been a place for people of color, of all different backgrounds, and out of work. And it had always been a social infrastructure in the city. And being able to, again, use art, landscape, and urbanism to project other images, other ways of thinking about place. For us, it gets at this semiotic and starts to change maybe how we see a freeway. We took a freeway sign and we actually put our heroes over the street. But this is the same freeway sign that carries 2 miles down the road, I-880. So it's the same object, but the object somehow gets reshaped, right, through different imagery. So if you see this one time, you'll never look at a sign on the freeway again as you go through a neighborhood. Or 3 trees in Chicago that try to call attention. This was at the Chicago Biennale, that calls attention to Washington Park and Jefferson Park in Chicago. Because even the names, I think people don't immediately say, oh, those are named after presidents. And they came in after the fair. Our President Barack Obama is building a library in Chicago. And I had read an article about the library was cutting down trees in the park. And of course, the trees were falling because of weather. But I was wondering, well, he's there with the other 2 presidents. So 3 trees reminds us, right, that the landscape is made up of these dualities. And I'd like to thank Director Loretta Yerlin for reminding me that 7 years ago, Carrie Mae, my beautiful Carrie Mae Weems, and I had a project for UMass Amherst, and it was a garden for Du Bois. And this is what Carrie wrote. She said, I had been repeatedly asking myself what kind of project could live beyond the confines of the museum and allow a great number of participants now and in the future. She said, while standing at her sink, admiring a peony, Sarah Bernhardt peony, brilliant in pink, it occurred to me that a flower could be named for W.E.B. Du Bois. So she called me, said, Walter, we have to do this project together. And I said, sure, Carrie. And so she cultivated this peony for W.E.B. Du Bois, and she asked me if I could look at the landscape and riff with her. And so the peony, I still think you can purchase the peony. I think it's, the last time I looked, it was still online. It was being distributed by Hollingsworth Farms. And it's just a wonderful idea of using a flower, something that was even seasonal, that would actually honor him. So I took this idea to task, and we wanted to create a very simple landscape, a landscape that had this call and response. And so we mounded and created, kind of within the rhododendron garden, a ground plane. And this ground plane would have an action and a reaction. And that became the place for the peonies. And there would be a walkway that you can walk around and understand it. This is the model that shows the dimpling of the landscape, and then a view of that sculptural ground. And then during certain times of the year, the ground would look as if it was waving, and at other times it would be in full bloom. And when the blooms go away, they yield to fall, and we get the dimples, they're inverted. And then in the snow, it becomes something other. So this idea of the double has always sort of been, I guess, in our ethos. I had totally forgotten about this project because it was never constructed. It was never approved by the committee. And I'm putting it out there so maybe someone will see it and maybe it can somehow be exhumed. This next project I'm going to show you is in Nashville, and it's called Witness Walls. And this was a small competition that we won, and it was to articulate and try to represent the civil rights movement here in Nashville. I went to school in Greensboro, so I thought we had the first sit-in, but evidently Nashville was almost first to the scene. Diane Nash and others boycotted the local Woolworth store, and they actually were able to integrate ahead of anyone else. But that story I never knew. As part of the project, we were privy to a lot of images that had been collected by the local newspaper, but they had never been shown. They're now in the African American History Museum in the library. And looking at these images, I was taken by the women who were walking their kids to school during this time. And some of the images, they just stayed with me so much that how could, as a small kid, how would you endure, right, this landscape? And so the witness walls became a way to work with the civil rights veterans, but also it became a way to kind of, again, think about the past and the present today. And so we wanted to basically create a space where people could go and sit and hear the music of the day, Aretha Franklin in the background, and look at the various images that maybe they've never seen before at full scale, as if you're looking at a block print. So on one side, we took those images of women and children and we made these new collages to create this different narrative about the civil rights movement and the idea of marching. Not only were people marching collectively, but they were marching separately. And it's tactile. There's a black aggregate. You can touch it. The light captures it in different ways. And again, it suggests that maybe there are other images we can put out in the world, and that all of them don't always have to be pedagogical, right? They don't have to teach us, but sometimes they can just be there for us. And on the other side of the wall, we use images, real images, and then we etch them in the concrete. And so when there's no light, you don't see the image, but when the light comes out, the images come to fruition. And this project, again, was a way of creating a public space where people could come. There are benches on both sides that pre-existed. And as I talked about, there's music. So it's a place to come, and it's a place to be. It's also a place to remember. And as we finished the project, the guy on the right is Freddie. And Freddie came up to me and said, "Walter, that's me." And Freddie had been involved with the project the whole time, but he never once said, "Walter, that's me in the picture." And I was kind of blown away by that. And as soon as he said that, there was a reporter nearby. He rushed up and Freddie disappeared. And it reminded me of that kind of silence, right? That I don't need to be seen. And living in the world today in the Instagram moment where everyone wants to be seen, sometimes it's that slow, silent march that gets us there. At the University of Virginia, we had the opportunity to pay homage to a Black woman, a free Black woman at the foot of the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's ecumenical village. It's a place called Canada, where as they were expanding the university to the south, they found bodies interned within the space. And I was working on the larger plan, and they asked me if I would take this on, and I said, sure. And what we found were these amazing kind of cultural arts that were part of Kitty Foster's homestead. Beautiful brickwork that was exhumed. There was also bodies of people and animals buried locally. So we wanted to create a place of spirituality in the shadows of Jefferson. But I wanted to sort of talk about something different, something more mythical. And so we developed this idea of a shadow catcher. And at this place, the shadow catcher links the visible with the unseen. And this is where I thought about this idea of the flash of the spirit, right? When you go and you have burial, you leave something that gives a reflection, and that reflection allows light to bounce off, and therefore you get a ride to heaven. And this idea that these myths can live in space. And so when light is present in the landscape, you get a shadow, and you look down at the ground when you see the shadow. And then at the middle of the space is an outline of the foundation of the home. And that's where the stainless steel band is, and the light reflects off of that band. And that forces you to look up. And so again, getting the body in space to move from down to up is how we wanted to remember Kitty Foster. And it's a strange sight because it's different. Again, it creates a double negative. It's not like anything around it. And then at the burial ground, we created a sculptural ground that is reminiscent of the local historic cemeteries where bodies are entombed in wood caskets, which really have this inflection in the landscape. And what's nice about this double, it sits next to the New Business School on one side. I think there's a Starbucks like right there. And so while you're having your coffee, you're looking out in this landscape, and students actually have to walk through this landscape. It's not fenced off. This next piece is called Double Sites. And this is one of the first projects where we attempted to be reflectant of the other half of the semiotic. This would be from the non brown side, the non-Black side, how could we begin to articulate what a double consciousness might be for someone who's privileged, for someone who doesn't have to be empathetic all the time about others. 3 years ago, I guess, or maybe 2 years ago, a couple years ago, the students got together, African-American students, and they went to the director, the president's office at Princeton, and they asked that Woodrow Wilson's name be taken off the School of Public Policy. They took over the office. The trustees met, and they came up with an idea for a competition to create a Woodrow Wilson marker. We were shortlisted with 3 other artists, architects, and we ended up getting the commission. And you can see the students had come together collectively to ask for this to happen. I didn't know much about Woodrow Wilson, but I came up to speed pretty fast. He's a Southerner like myself. I think his father was a pastor. Very complex person. But I also go back to the double consciousness that I wanted to use Du Bois as a way of critiquing Wilson. And this idea of the double consciousness, it's like, how do you get someone to feel that empathy for others? And is there a particular way that we could open Wilson up and actually show that his contemporaries were begging him, right, to be a better person? And so it sits next, the site sits directly next to the school. There's a 1966 Fountain of Freedom by Fitzgerald. And in 2005, the Cornell Rothschild family donated a bosque of trees here. It's also, I would say, that's the square of Princeton. So it's not only for people in the university, but also for the city itself. And the idea for this piece was very simple. We took a square and we cut the square in a diagonal. We made one of the triangles white and one black, and then we had the white one rest on the black. It's 39 feet tall. And then we wanted to put the voices of people, of his contemporaries, on that inside face. Because when you cut a square at a diagonal, that diagonal actually becomes the widest part of the triangle, and the 2 smaller sides are on the outside. And so within the apex, text and image takes your eyes up, and that's metaphorically the inside. Right? And the outside, we allow Wilson's words to reverberate on the outside. See it in its context. In the plan view, we took out 2 trees and plopped it in the middle. And then his contemporaries, Trotter, have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your own African-American fellow citizens? Weldon Johnson, we pressed him for promise to make a specific utterance against mob violence and lynching. Du Bois, we want to be treated as men. So these quotes sort of fill that inside within stainless steel. And then on the outside, we have Wilson's words that relate from everything to education, labor policy, race and segregation, et cetera. And the idea would be that inside piece would be a space. So that consciousness would become spatial, right? And that you would see yourself within it, right? Dealing with these conflicting agendas. And this is the piece on opening. It's made of mirror stone, so it reflects its surroundings. It more reflective than I thought, and the text of Wilson gets muted in the white and in the black stone, so you have to go up to it. You have to be present with the piece. And at night, a light comes up with the Fountain of Freedom and glows that inner heart. And here you can kind of see on the outside how you have to get up pretty close to read those words. And the words are unedited. They're almost like constantly flowing. And then the inside, you see the words taking you up and the images on the left side. We use lenticular for the images. I will show that in a minute, but through the reflection, the piece is really, it almost dematerializes as you move around it. And then at night, the faces of Du Bois Booker T, and others pervade and come full force. This is Ida B. Wells. And then Du Bois himself. And we try to show them young to old as you move through. And then at night, some of the text becomes even more poignant. And one small thing that we didn't know, that the school would actually be reflected in the piece. Here's a piece by women's suffrage. How long must women wait for liberty, Mr. President? What will you do for women's suffrage? And this was the opening. This was a year or so ago, not doing COVID the year prior. And the students still wanted the name off the building. So it's become this kind of site of protest. And last summer, I got a call from the director of the school, and she informed me that they were removing Woodrow Wilson's name from the building. And she had said in a small sort of note that one of the trustees had come out and read some of the quotes on the wall. And that changed her vote. And the last project I'd like to show with you is in Charleston, South Carolina. I've been working in Charleston for the last decade. And I came here primarily for Spoleto, the art festival, working with the Gullah Geechee cultures throughout the Charleston Islands and along the rivers. These places that are here, these are all African-American, what I would call enclaves. And most of these are where our ancestors actually, when they were freed from plantations, settled right next to their plantations. And in most cases, most of these places are right next to the water, or they're in wetland areas, which are now being prone to suburban single-family development. The Gullah Geechee coast goes from North Carolina all the way down to Florida. It is a national coastline, but it doesn't have the teeth to actually protect a lot of these places. For 4 months in 2007 or 2007, 4 artists and myself, we grew rice here to talk about the rice culture, which, you know, you don't hear a lot about slaves and swamps and the rice culture here in Charleston. And unbeknownst to me, this would be the beginning of my work in this area. The International African American Museum hired us to create what we call our Ancestors Garden, which is inspired by Toni Morrison's A Bench by the Road. The museum will be a center for international learning for families and groups. And it will really be more about understanding American history, and particularly the African-American experience in the low country of Charleston, South Carolina. It's located on the neck. If you've been to Charleston, it's right 2 buildings down from the aquarium, but it's also located right on the harbor. We're about 4 blocks from Mother Emanuel Church, where the massacre of the pastor and his congregation during a Bible study evening by a 21-year-old young white man from North Carolina happened. It's also a place where the borough houses sit, which are remnants of the old Black neighborhood. It's a site, like many Black landscapes, that had to be exhumed. It was forgotten. It's called Gadsden's Wharf. And we believe, with the historians and scholars and archaeologists, that at least 40, at a minimum, 40% of the African slave diaspora actually landed here and were bought and sold or perished here on the site. This little rectilinear piece you see is a warehouse. And this is where slaves made the Atlantic crossing. They would shelter them at Fort Moultrie, Sullivan's Island, incubate them. The ones who survived would then cross the harbor and land here at Gadsden and be placed in this warehouse until days to be sold. There are stories of the food chain changing in the harbor because of all the bodies that were there, that shark feeding changed. But one can't imagine this site from looking at it today. Today, well, yesterday it was a park. You see a person here walking their dog. It's a pretty fallow space. but beneath that surface sits that history. The late Harry Cobb of Pay, Cobb and Freed is the architect for the building. He's designed a very simple building that sits about 13 feet in the air because of hurricanes. And he called me up and said, Walter, this is a landscape, this is a burial ground. So this is really about the ground plane. And could you come and help and work on the project? Our project for, well, I think it's very simple. To the north, next to the pumping station, which protects the neck, because during high waters, there's a huge pipe that goes under this landscape. We've created a sweetgrass field. And the sweetgrass is what used to grow in the marshlands. And it's where the Gullah learned basket weaving. And a lot of the sweetgrass now has perished within the city. So that creates this large garden. And as you make your way south, it turns into these parterres. And these parterres are riffing on the parterres of Middleton, but they become other types of parterres, places to grow rice, places to sit, places of stele gardens, places of ethnobotanic gardens. And then as you make your way under the building, we've created one surface, and that surface is tabby. And tabby is a crust shell from the Atlantic Ocean, from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And that goes up on the columns and rises up to the building. This is a place for event and participation. And then as you make your way south, you encounter the old warehouse. The site will be open 24/7, just like most spaces in Charleston. It reminded me of the ghost tours that you can take in Charleston and in Savannah, right? You walk around and they talk about the past, but we want to also talk about the ghosts of our ancestors here. So as you come in from the city, we've created these primary dunes, which again, allow you to understand that you're close to water. But then when you turn back, it encloses you from the city. You can sort of see the tabby rising up on the columns. The sweetgrass field, as you walk through, there's a stainless steel band that begins on one end and marks its way to the other, where the different places where slaves were taken from will be placed. There's a brick wall that talks about the kind of contribution of the hands of small kids as well as artisans within Charleston itself. There's a stele garden that takes the inert, or these rocks that are alive, and within each one, sound will be playing with a different dialect from a different place. And then the ethnobotanic garden talks about the types of botanical influences that came with the slaves. As there's stories of women hiding seeds in their hair, in their braids. And in the planters that look and plan like a parterre, but they actually become rice planters, places where we could propagate rice and tell this story. And then looking back south towards the warehouse, since we don't own the entire length of it, we have a small portion where Maya Angelou words will be broadcast across the wall. And then as you walk through, you encounter the rice Negro. And these were slaves who could stand in water for long periods of time without contracting malaria. And we're working on those figures now, trying to figure out, ways in which we didn't want them to be that formal repose that I showed, but something a little bit more contested to get people to see. And then lastly, being inspired by the Brooks maps, which is a Dutch ship that I think made about 11 voyages across the Atlantic. But it was the first to show this lithograph where you see bodies laid head to toe by gender and by age, packed into the hull of a ship. And I was taken by, when I was out at Sullivan's Island, in their meager museum, there was an image of the Brooks map, and I didn't know if it was part of the lithograph or just something that was Xeroxed, but it also looked like textile. And so I used this piece because I wanted to riff on the kind of the meagerness of the representation and expand it. And so next to the water with Pay, Cobb and Freed, we've created this infinity fountain. It's about a quarter amount of water. It drains back towards the building. It's almost metaphorically lifting the harbor up and bringing it to the shelf. And within that, we've carved out these bodies, these figures and we've allowed the tabby to disappear from the surface and come out in the actual bodies themselves. But it's the interest that we have is the shale, the material, right? And getting people, again, this thing in your mind to sort of begin to see that figure, but also the presence of landscape and the presence of the ocean. And when these get played out in a serial nature, you actually begin to kind of see the density of bodies across a scale, looking out towards the Atlantic. And this is a really bad video, but I wanted to show you how it reflects, the shales will actually have this reflective quality. And so at the edge, as you go out and look back, at certain times of day, the water will be full across the top. But then I think every hour and a half, it'll drain out. And you'll actually see those figures with puddles. And then the water will fill up again. And drain out again. I want to conclude with a short video. Since you're in Massachusetts, the Boston Globe did a piece on reconstructions, which is a show featuring 10 Black artists and architects at MoMA, where we have organized a show that really talks about Black architecture, but also this notion of reconstruction. Thank you. I'll welcome the dean back.
The dean is back. The dean is back.
Sorry that I had to cut in on you.
No, well, I feel like that timing was just, if my internet had to drop, that was sort of the perfect moment. I'm sorry I didn't get to read the full extent of your biography.
That's okay, don't worry.
But I appreciate your graciousness and flexibility. We have a bit of time left, and a number of people submitted questions. First, let me say thank you. That was beautiful and powerful and provocative in so many ways. And I have to tell you personally, you were my dream for the inaugural lecture. I couldn't have dreamt anything better than this. So I'm really indebted to you. A number of people submitted questions, so I will turn to those questions first and try to intersperse them with some observations to have a bit of a conversation with you. I want to start by acknowledging a couple of questions that were just submitted and that people were texting me while you were speaking, that we got to get that garden going here at UMass. So I think I might have to call the chancellor later tonight.
I'm just thanking Loretta for reminding me, because
yes,
like with most projects that don't happen, I try to forget them because they're just so like, oh.
Well, there are some 200, I'm looking 258 participants now, plus some folks who had to leave earlier for other meetings. We won't let you forget. We won't forget for sure. A number of people had submitted questions, so I'll group them together, asking about your early career inspirations, and also asking about your reflections on the field of landscape architecture. And what we know about that field as well as the field of architecture is that the number of Black landscape architects, Black architects, people of color in general in the field remains very low. And, so I think people were interested in hearing your thoughts about that, as well as your thoughts about what drew you to the field and how you got started.
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I just think, for a lot of people of color in this country, our access to education, has been relatively late and new. So when one thinks about choosing a profession, like I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I wanted to go to art school, and my dad said, "You're not going to art school, right? You're going to go to college and get a." And so I then looked at engineering, right? Because that was like very clear. But then I looked at architecture, right? And I went to an HBCU, North Carolina A&T, and they had architecture program. And while I was in the program, there was an announcement that they were starting a landscape architecture program. Now, this is like my freshman year, so I'm taking, chemistry, physics, all of these courses. I'm like, where is the creative stuff? And I remember going to a lecture for this program, and they were showing these beautiful drawings. I think it was Paul Friedberg, maybe it was Larry Halper, and some others. And I was like, wow, that's much better. And so me and my colleague, we actually joined the program and became we're like the first 10, maybe there was 11 of us who were the first to graduate from an HBCU in landscape architecture. I think out of the 11 of us, probably half of us stayed in the profession. So on one hand, coming at it that way, but then practicing, my first decade of practicing, I very quickly saw that I was in this white world. I was in a world where no one looked like me. I always felt inferior for some reason because people knew these other things that I didn't know. And then I ran into a Black landscape architect in Philadelphia and worked for him for a few years. But that was still not enough. And that's when I decided to go back to school and go back into architecture, because I was beginning to see architecture had more history and theory associated to it that I found more malleable. And while I was studying architecture, I started working for Garrett Ekbo, who's like one of the fathers of modernism in landscape architecture. And then I went back and got a master's in landscape architecture. And then I went into landscape. To make a long story short, it's been a long ride for me to kind of find my place within the profession. And the thing that liberated me more than anything was Garrett Ekbo told me one day, he said, to do socially responsible work, it can still be beautiful. And that's the first time someone gave me a license that I could have empathy and it could still be beautiful, because it's almost like, oh, if you're empathetic or whatever, it's like, it can't look beautiful. And that's why a lot of our environments look the way they do. That, I was very early, one of my colleagues, I remember telling me, it's like, how dare you, what did they say? They said, how dare you use these people in this neighborhood as guinea pigs for your ideas? And I was like, it's not guinea pigs. Have you seen the neighborhood? And all I did was plant 150 purple trees, right? I mean, this idea that beauty, you can't do something beautiful in a marginalized place. And that had an effect on me. And that's pretty much been the challenge of my career, trying to convince others that these places that we've degraded for so long, they need more than the places that we keep giving more to. Because these are the places where my ancestors have lived. And so, long story short, I don't think, there will probably never be this large majority of people of color in the profession. Because again, when you look at the numbers, they don't play out. But I think you're seeing more and more people getting into professions that shape the environment. And so I think those professions have expanded more. And so I think landscape architecture is part of planning, art, uh, ecology, conservation. I mean, so there are these larger, more, I think, collective culture that I think is responding to a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Um, One of the things that struck me, especially in the last segment of your presentation, talking about, now I have to check my notes. I've forgotten the name of the Gadsden's Wharf, right? The Ancestors Garden. Um, a couple of thoughts occurred to me. One, I was really struck by, what you were talking about thinking about the materials, right? The shale, and sort of showing the connections between the materials and the bodies. And that made me think a lot about the history of slavery, right? And if we think about really how the landscape, right, the terrain is infused with the bodies of enslaved people, right? Whether it's burial grounds, even if we think about bloodshed
Yeah.
in cotton fields, on rice plantations, murdered bodies. Even your story that you began the presentation of talking about, that awful experience of having to sort of hide in the ditches.
Yeah.
And I was thinking there too, right? Oh, there's a Black landscape,
Yeah.
right? All those hiding
Yeah.
places. And the play, and so, but I wonder if you could talk, and there were a number of questions as well, where people were curious about your thoughts about everything ranging from energy infrastructure to climate change to conservation. And so I'll take the liberty of sort of grouping those questions and rephrasing them, and just sort of asking if you could share your thoughts about thinking about conservation and natural materials and the relationship between your practice and how you approach thinking about the natural world, right? Thinking about things like the water, the sharks in the
Yeah.
bay.
Well, thinking along, I started out with this notion of the double consciousness and semiotic, and that also took me to this place of hybridity, right? So if you know post-colonial theory, the idea of hybridity, but I was more interested in hybridity as it relates to the landscape that we've made here and how it's already changed, right? And the more privileged view of it is to return back to origin, right? Which is a complete fiction, right? And so one of my earlier projects, I was working with some ecologists, and we were unearthing creeks in East Oakland. And they were getting like $500,000 from the state to go in and repair these riparian areas. And I thought that they were returning them to the way they used to function. But in actuality, they don't flood anymore because all the high waters are in a pipe and taken somewhere else. But they were spending money to create these fictions, basically. And most of these were in impoverished neighborhoods. Right? And everybody kept talking about how this was making people's lives better. Now, creeks in California, in Northern California, they're about 20 feet deep because they're incised. And they become these dumping grounds because in a marginal neighborhood, no sidewalks, people just, oh, I can dump my trash here. And so I slowly became disinterested in the creek, which in my department was like, whoa, how can you not be interested in the creek? And I started working with the community, and we planted 150 purple leaf plum trees. And when I proposed it, the people from the city was like, this is a monoculture, it's not ecological, da, 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 da. And I said, but the creek is not real, and the street matters more to the health of the place. And they said, well, we'll let the community vote. And I wasn't there, and the community saw the images of this ecological thing and these purple trees. They were like, we want the purple trees. So we planted the purple trees, and 25 years later, they're still there. They bloom every year, and it's a hybrid landscape. And that means that, when we're thinking about ecology, people are part of that ecology. And so when I think of climate change, I think our actions should be going to all the red line areas of our cities because they're the most vulnerable, and we should invest because these are still places where people like me still live. And that's how I would begin to combat the degradation of environment, because a lot of it is cultural and it's not ecological per se, but it's cultural. It's the things that we do.
Thank you. This, I think, leads really nicely to a number of other questions that we got, and one that somebody has just put in the chat. Can you share your thoughts or maybe reflect on this? I'll read the question as it's written in the chat. And for those of you who submitted similar versions, this is for you as well. Providing marginalized communities more spaces that are beautiful raises the issue of gentrification and pushing current residents out. And so I don't know how you want to approach that one, but we had, a couple of other questions about sort of how do you think about creating beautiful spaces in marginalized communities and think about gentrification at the same time?
I again, it's one of these things I hear all the time. I live in a red line community for years, and my office is still there in Oakland. Nothing has happened in my neighborhood for 20 years since I've been there because of this fear. There's been more social services placed there. It's gotten worse. The life expectancy, some of the old guys I used to see are not there anymore. And I think it's a travesty that we've put this idea of keeping people in a ghetto environment because we're afraid of the capitalist structure that we promote on one hand. And we need to basically see that in a lot of these places, we need to go in and help people actually, one, attain ownership in places, but also make sure that once they do that, that the value of their places actually be valued versus devalued. And one of the biggest things we have in Oakland is these spaces are so devalued that people can't do anything with them because their appraisals are like half of what just across the street in a neighborhood that doesn't look like them. And so you're kind of trapped between the two. I'm an artist and designer, so the things that I'm good at is creating beauty. And what we try to do is work with other nonprofits and other groups to help to make sure that infrastructure is there. The problem what we have in my city is it's actually all the way to the mayor's office. And people have this view, and that's my piece at MoMA. I actually created this project called Black Towers, Black Power. And I said, what if you built high rises in my street? And what if they came through this Black ethos? And could they look different? And could we make something different? So I think, we have a lot of work to do because, again, these ideas of gentrification, a lot of the times it's not coming from us. It's not coming from us. I hear from my neighbors who look like me. It's like, why is our landscape devalued? Why is our light pollution the highest in the city? Why is, one after the other? And so we have a lot of work to do. It's not just simply beautification.
So thank you. This gets me to another question that was pre-submitted. Have you seen a change over time in the course of your practice in the kinds of conversations you've had with local communities, right? About what they want to see in their communities, what kinds of spaces people would like. Has that changed over time in your experience?
In the last year, it's kind of been like the last year has sped up 20 years. We're working in Jacksonville, Florida right now in one of the neighborhoods called La Villa, where the Johnson brothers, sort of wet their chops and everything. And we're designing a park for the Johnson brothers at their own homestead. But we've taken over the entire 16-block neighborhood. We're looking at the colored waiting room. So we're basically exhumed more, and people are appreciative, right? Because there is this, I think, yearning right now, like, what do we do? And a lot of cities are saying it's time. But there's still places that, before COVID, I was removed from a couple of projects because I brought up a Black landscape. And it's like, oh, we're not ready for this, right? And this is like 2019. And I think people are a little bit more ready, but you still have those reservations.
Maybe related to this, somebody asked a question about how can uplifting Black landscapes, what role might that play in an idea of Black joy and radical joy, a sense of joy?
Yeah, we were just talking about that at a lecture the Black Reconstructive Collective talked about. I always think about, when I was growing up, Richard Pryor he was the main comedian. And I just remember always hearing this one thing. It's like, all people want is some sunshine on their face. And it never, when I heard that when I was a kid, I never thought about what it meant. But when we was meeting was people are just in these dark places. And a lot of time it's just people need some sunshine, Like I've been noticing here in my neighborhood during COVID, people are walking, people want to be outside, but if you live in environments that don't have trees, a simple thing, good sidewalks. I mean, those simple, basic things, and you will see that joy. You will see that joy. So I think it's very simple. I just think we make it too complex, actually.
I love that. Thank you. Sunshine on your face. I like that. I grew up with Richard, Richard Pryor sneaking to stay up late to watch him on Saturday Night Live as a kid. So I remember this very well. You talked a lot in your presentation. The historian in me loved all of the history that's in your work and that was in this presentation. And so a number of people, I think, also wanted to know, I guess, to hear more of your thoughts about your sense of how history has informed contemporary landscape design. And you've spoken to that a little bit. But, for me, thinking about the palimpsest, right, that analogy of sort of the double meaning, even the Du Bois double consciousness, right, and realizing that there's no single American history, right? And you started even by referencing the 1619 project. So could you maybe talk to us a little bit about how in your practice, what inspires you when you thinking about history? What is it that you want to bring to the surface?
Well, I guess it starts out with, I had some really good historians as professors. One of my favorites, Spiro Kostoff, who wrote the history of architecture, and some others. But they made history come alive. It wasn't just learning dates. And I remember the one lecture that Spiro gave, it was called The Third Rome. And he talked about, and it wasn't fashionable then, this is like the late 80s, early 90s, he was talking about fascism. And he talked about the Third Rome through Mussolini and what Mussolini did to the landscape. How he drained the marshes, how he, took these country settlements and put them into towns. And then he related that to the new town. He basically paralleled and showed what we were doing in our country and the new towns we were making, right? I mean, and so he made history come alive. And that was the first time I started to see the causality, right, of decisions that one makes. And, in America, if you read Go Tell It on the Mountain by Baldwin, there's a moment where Baldwin, I think it's his birthday, his mom gives him some money to go downtown. He's escaping from his father. And he goes to Central Park and he runs up on a hill. And he's on that hill and he's like, I could be anyone I want to, he's just reeling and he's looking out over the city and he's all by himself. And then he runs down the hill and he bumps into an old white guy. And he's back and he freaks out and he's about to apologize. And I had never thought about Olmsted and Baldwin together, right? And to me, history is, bringing these things together to allow you to see the relationships between things. And I don't think we do that enough, right, historically. And for me, that's how we like to use history. Like I was telling my student yesterday who's writing on Blacks' access to parks. And I said, so have you read Galen Park's Politics of Park Design? And he said, no. I was like, you're almost done with your thesis and you don't know the transformation of the American parks through the politics of it and through the social cultural strife. And there have been 5 major movements in park building in this country, and it all deals with race. The first one was the Pleasure Garden, which was done by Olmsted, where he was like, yeah, it's democratic, but people didn't really want to be democratic. And so they had to come up with a reform park. And the reform park took the immigrants and reformed them. Then they came up with Park and Rec because we needed a double. And so instead of giving us a pleasure garden, we got a Park and Rec, which was a basketball court, swimming pools, and a community center. And then after that, it just became open space, right? And so now we're into this kind of ecological park. And so we have to understand these histories because, again, you can trace the politics of our society and how we actually think we want to live together through the manifestation of these things. And that, to me, what history does for us. So it's not just, checking the marks. It's really telling us who we are, where we've been, and hopefully it'll give us a different way to get somewhere else.
Thank you. So there's a question that came in through the live Q&A that I think dovetails nicely with this, which is, could you talk a little bit more about the challenges of daylighting these truths, right? And we might say these histories in spaces where they've been intentionally buried, right? And what that experience has been like in your practice.
Oh, I've been black-faced. In 1999 in Macon, Georgia, guy put a mop on his head, a Hawaiian shirt, stuff on his face, and mimicked me. So that, right? And that's like, 20 years ago. Sometimes, people, they don't see the value. A lot of the times we've been, I wouldn't say subversive, but we've talked about it in just a different way. So instead of having it be the number one thing, it's just part of the work. Lafayette Square is a good example of that, where it looks like it's a sculptural thing, but it's actually not. It's loaded with this kind of palimpsest history, but you just can't see it. But the body moves in the same way, right? The park used to be an X, right? And at the middle was an oak tree. And that's where all the guys hung out. But you could come from every corner and get to the middle. And today you can still do that, but there's no pathways. And I had to argue with someone because one of the corners is a children's playground. And we had an opening coming through and they wanted us to fence it off. And their reasoning was someone would walk through the children's playground. But these are just, codified things. But I think, again, there are ways in which we can kind of push and reveal things to people.
Thank you. That's, I like this, right? It's just low, it's just not number one, right? It's there. And in some ways, I think that speaks to a lot of the work that a lot of us are doing. One of the things that I've been saying in my various leadership roles is, if equity and diversity are our core values, right, it should be in everything we're doing, right? It doesn't have to be the headliner, right? But it always has to be, that's what we need to think about. It has to be a part of everything we do. There's nothing then that doesn't engage this. There were some other questions. One that struck me, and as I was again thinking about your presentation, so you're on the West Coast, you're in California, and have done projects there and have done projects all over the country. And the question was, have you seen regional differences? How do the Eastern states compare with the Western states on these issues?
Oh yeah. Well, they both coasts don't want to deal with the past, right? But the East Coast, my God, it's so, you're so entrenched with this ostensible past, versus the West is newer, right, relatively, but it's just more open, right? There's a kind of there's a more individual freedom, I think, to a certain degree, to cultivate ideas. And I think a lot of it has to do with density. but it also has to do with a kind of a carefreeness, right, culturally. And it is, people go like, because I remember going back to a couple of jobs on the East Coast, it's like, and I would say something, I was, you're from the West Coast, right? Or like try to get a project in New York. It's like, we don't plant palm trees here. It's like, what? Like I was born on the East Coast. I know that, come on. So it is different. But both places, it's really hard to deal with the past, and particularly the racial past. There is a kind of, people just want to forget, right? People in charge want to forget. And it's trying to get them to say, no, we need to remember. But it's very easy. So I would just say everywhere, you have to work hard at it. You just have to work hard.
Thank you. So, as an East Coaster, I'm going to ask you a question about an East Coast monument. There was a question that came in asking for your thoughts on the landscape of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., since the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And in your view, has this monument influenced local landscapes, or have local landscapes influenced the monument?
I mean, at Jay's, the museum is a beautiful museum.
Yeah.
But it's like the other museums. There's a Native Indian museum. It's a museum on the mall. Its landscape is not that different than any other landscape. It's a place where culture resides inside of the building. Now, the building, I think, has a power in the landscape next to the monument, the vertical monument, and the crown. So I think that's a power. But the mall still exists as a mall, right? You can't change that fiction, right? It's the thing for me that DC does. It sets the tone for us not to think about place, right? Because DC is a wetland, and if you've ever walked down the mall, you get near the Vietnam Memorial, you can actually hear the pumps. They're pumping water. I just was part of a piece for the tidal basin. If you go to the tidal basin after a rain event, the benches are in the water. The King Memorial is basically going to be flooded in 10 years. And so by keeping that landscape, right, the mall, what the message we're sending everywhere else is drain the marshes, right? You don't have to look at place. And DC is one of those places that always, the fiction of it always disturbed me. Because once I was doing a membership, an apprenticeship at the Smithsonian about 10 years, maybe 7 years ago. And it was the hottest day on record in DC. And I arrived late at night to my hotel at the Monaco, and there was no air conditioning. And I was like, why is there no air conditioning? There were fans everywhere. And they were saying, Mr. Hood, we're really sorry. There's no air conditioning because we can't get cold water. It's so hot that the water table is so low that the pipes are very close to the surface. So all the water was heated. And so basically had to wait for it to get cool. And that's when it's like, man, do we want to keep living this way?
Yeah, interesting. I was thinking anyone who's been in DC in July knows
right?
that it's a city
knows
built
that.
on a swamp, right?
Right.
Between the humidity and the mosquitoes, you're in swampland. There was another question that came in. Would you ever be interested in finishing the Emerald Necklace? The parks are not connected in majority Black neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's a sounding yes.
Because
that project, the necklace, is an infrastructural project, right? So, it's actually dealing with stormwater and a lot of different things. So it's not just about recreation, which I think is the brilliance of the project.
A couple of people, I want to be respectful of your time, but there are a couple more questions that I'd like to get to and then wrap up. A number of people submitted questions in advance, and there's one that just came in. Do you feel that there are specifics that designers, specifically white designers, should be doing when designing in historically Black neighborhoods and landscapes with majority Black populations that they're not currently doing? right? And that maybe if you don't mind, I'll tag on another question that came in previously. Um, do you find that the landscape architecture professional code of ethics adequately addresses social concerns? So I don't know, that's a lot to lump on you
That's
in
a
one
lot,
question.
yeah. But I think I can answer this very quickly. That, I think we could look at Du Bois and this idea of the double consciousness, right? It's about a veil, right? Which I have to always kind of think about. It's like, imagine if you're always looked about as race first, right? At a certain point, you conform, right? And so you have to create a separate identity, right? And for a lot of brown, black, Asian people in this country, we've had to put aside our identity and adopt a new one. We've actually had to learn more about whiteness. I think I learned more about whiteness my first 18 years of my life than I learned about blackness, right? And I think that's the issue. So it's not about what do I do, it's about how do I learn, right? How do I see the other side? And that means you got to learn the stuff. I mean, like I've learned it. I mean, I know about George Washington. I mean, I know all of this stuff. I mean, I knew very little about Baldwin until I went to college. I knew very little about Du Bois until I went to college. In high school, I got very little. And so I think this is our problem in this country is education, right? And we need to not be fearful of education, right? And I'm tired of people who don't look like me saying, how do I do? It's like, do the work. Like, I've been doing the work all my life. Because, I work in Wyoming. I work in places where people don't look like me. And no one ever asks me that question. How can you design for that? Right? And that to me is what we have to deal with. And I know it's tough and it's hard, but, it's liberating though at a certain point. And my courses, I taught a course on landscape and memory in the past year before COVID. And the students were like, thank God, why haven't we read this stuff before, right? And I do think it's not saying that, Western education, you don't want to do that. We just got to make it more inclusive so that people can hear those multiple voices and those multiple stories. And then have a way in which we can envision ourselves, because I think you mentioned it, we're not as different as we say we are, right? I mean, I grew up in the South, and, it's like a lot of things. Everybody ate grits. South Carolina, everybody eats rice. I mean, there are certain things that just bring us together. Food, music, fashion, those are things that bring us together. And it's like, we need to figure out how to do it in space, right? What are those things that make it happen in space? And so I think we just have to learn a little bit more about each other.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that I've seen in, the past 20 some years of teaching is that our students, and you mentioned your students a couple of times, that our students really are ready for this, right? Ready for these conversations. Yeah. Our white students, I mean, our students of color have been demanding this. I said to a group of students, September, October, this is a group of students of color primarily, this is breaking my heart, because in 1980, whatever, when I was in college, we had the same thing, demands, right? And concerns. And, so that was a little heartbreaking, a lot heartbreaking. On the other hand, what I think has changed is that our white students are asking for these conversations now. Yeah. And that, I think, thinking of what gives me hope, that's something that I feel like is a point of hope in all of this. The conversations in many quarters are much more broad-based than they used to be. Let me end with a question that maybe encapsulates much of what we've talked about today. Is there an element of the Black landscape that you find most characterizes the past 400 years in America? And the specific question was characterizes the demographic shift over the past 400 years. But, maybe we could broaden that out of, is there something that most characterizes the Black landscape for you?
Something that most characterizes it. I mean, there's nothing that specific. I mean, I can think about, but there's definitely a kind of a regionalism that I do think has emerged and is more visible to people today. And I will just say that in the last election with the how Georgia has kind of changed, right? And for me, like when I think of the South now, it's a way to kind of, it almost is emblematic of our experience, right? And the change, how hard those changes happen. And then I think you can look also to those places where these migrations happen. DC is one, Chicago is another. These places where these cities still bear the great Black ways, right? Whether it's the South Side of Chicago. But it's through that diaspora, I think, is a way that we can begin to kind of understand this time. And when you get out west, it's a little different because we forget that there were these east-west migrations, but there were always these southern migrations, which I didn't even know about. And so in a way, you kind of begin to sort of see how we've contributed in a diverse way, right, to the fabric of the American landscape. And so I think the bigger thing is that we're not one big diaphanous group. That's a very complex diaspora, and those contributions are diverse as well.
Oh, that was beautiful. I think that's a perfect spot for us to end this evening. So let me again thank you, Professor Walter Hood, for giving us your time, your insights, your thoughts, sharing your work with us. It really, as I said at the start, I couldn't have dreamed a better inaugural lecture for this series. So I'm really grateful to you and appreciative of you and your work and sharing it with us at UMass today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure as well. And it's a pleasure to meet you. And of course, I'm looking forward to our many conversations about Charleston.
Well, yeah, Charleston and the peony garden, right? Charleston and the garden up here in Amherst. Let's not forget that.
I will tell Carrie Bay that I'm pushing Carrie.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.